Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corin. We've talked in some episodes about the major monoliths of cloud computing, Google Cloud Platform or GCP, AWS, Azure, Alibaba, and arguably IBM as well. And these are these gigantic companies that collectively have a vast swathe of the world's computing power. And what I find interesting is thinking about how much of the world's computing is actually, cloud computing is actually ultimately backed by these providers, and how much is actually not. If you look at an app, it's common to see that they're using Firebase. It was built on Firebase, and their actual infrastructure is presumably backed on a Google Cloud server. You then have these resellers, let's say VPS hosting providers, shared hosting providers, if anyone still uses them, companies like Vercel, Netlify, and the list goes on of all these companies that are selling you some kind of compute service, and it has to be running somewhere. And my question is, Herman and Corin, this whole hierarchy or umbrella that exists, if you consider AWS to just be the very tip of a large iceberg, and you have a direct customers that they're selling to. They also sell to government and to business, as we've talked about before. But then they have a distribution chain that could almost be thought of as white labeling in terms of how it's presented to consumers. You don't know. It doesn't really matter unless you're really looking at it from a data federacy standpoint, whether who's ultimately providing the underlying computer, the underlying storage. You just see the branding of your provider, and they get it from AWS. I'd love to know, Herman and Corin, about the economics involved in those who truly own their own infrastructure. Think about maybe smaller, more boutique or more niche providers, and how much work that actually is for them to set up. How large is this ecosystem that builds under AWS and sells indirectly, whether to consumers, businesses, or even governments? And from the standpoint of AWS, if I were to start a web hosting company of some kind based in Jerusalem, just to give an example, and I were reselling Google Cloud Platform, presumably I don't just sign up for a GCP account, start creating instances for my customers, and hope that Google doesn't realize I'm actually a reseller. I presume there's some specific track and protocol that everyone has to go through in a vetting process. So that seems like a good enough basis for our episode, Herman and Corin. Let's talk about how cloud computing actually works, not just in what we see, but actually the mechanics of the distribution and reselling networks that exist beneath these big infrastructures. Over to you two.
You know, Herman, I was looking at my phone the other morning during that brief outage we had. The one where half the apps on my home screen just refused to initialize. And it hit me how much of our lives actually lives in the cloud. It is one of those things we take for granted until a major service goes down and suddenly half the internet is broken. It feels like we are all living in this giant digital apartment complex and we do not even know who the landlord is.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are right to feel that way, Corn. It is that classic invisible infrastructure problem. We only notice it when it fails. But the structure of that infrastructure is far more layered and, frankly, far more precarious than most people realize. We are now in February of 2026, and the complexity has only compounded since the AI boom of the last few years. The cloud is not just a place where you store your photos anymore, it is the literal engine of global intelligence.
Exactly. And Daniel's prompt today is about exactly that. He wants us to look past the big names we always hear, like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud Platform, and understand the actual hierarchy of how computing power gets to us. It is not just a bunch of servers in a room. It is a massive multi-tiered distribution network. Daniel wants to know about the economics, the white labeling of the cloud, and what it actually takes to own the metal yourself.
It is a fascinating ecosystem. Most people think of the cloud as a single destination, but it is really a global supply chain. You have the massive wholesalers at the top, the hyperscalers, and then you have this whole world of resellers, managed service providers, and boutique shops underneath them. It is almost like the difference between a massive oil refinery and a local gas station. They are both in the energy business, but their operations, their margins, and their risks look nothing alike.
I love that analogy. So, let us start at the top of the pyramid. When we talk about the monoliths, we are talking about the big 5 or 6. Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, Alibaba, and maybe IBM or Oracle. These guys are the ones actually pouring billions of dollars into concrete, steel, and silicon. As of this year, AWS still holds the lead, but Azure has been closing the gap significantly, largely because of their integration with OpenAI and the massive enterprise shift toward generative AI.
Right. They own the land, the buildings, the power substations, and the actual fiber optic cables under the ocean. When you use Amazon Web Services, you are essentially renting a tiny slice of a global machine that cost hundreds of billions of dollars to build. But what is interesting is how that compute power then filters down. Think about a service like Firebase. Most mobile developers use it for their database or authentication. Firebase looks like its own thing, but it is actually a suite of tools built entirely on top of Google Cloud infrastructure. It is a specialized interface designed to make Google Cloud easier to use for a specific type of person.
Right, and if you're using Firebase, you might not even have a Google Cloud account in the traditional sense. You're interacting with an abstraction. And this goes even further with companies like Vercel or Netlify. These are essentially platform as a service providers that have become incredibly popular with web developers. If I deploy a website to Vercel, I'm not thinking about servers or regions or load balancers. I'm just pushing code. But where does that code actually run?
In almost every case, it is running on Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud. Vercel is essentially a highly specialized, very polished layer of software that sits on top of the big monoliths. They are reselling compute, but they are adding so much value in the form of developer experience that people are happy to pay a premium for it. It is a classic arbitrage play. They buy raw compute at wholesale prices from Amazon, often using what are called reserved instances or savings plans to get the lowest possible rate, and then they package it with an incredible interface and automated workflows. They sell it at a higher price point to developers who do not want to spend their lives configuring virtual private clouds or managing Kubernetes clusters.
So it is essentially white labeling for the digital age. But that brings up an interesting question about the economics. If I am a company like Vercel, I am essentially at the mercy of my provider's pricing, right? If Amazon raises their prices, or if they change how they charge for data egress, which has been a huge topic of debate recently with the European Data Act, Vercel has to either eat that cost or pass it on. How much of the world's cloud is actually independent of these big players?
That is the million-dollar question. If you look at the market share data for 2026, the top three, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, control about 67% of the global cloud infrastructure market. If you add in Alibaba and Tencent, you are looking at nearly 80%. The remaining 20% is where it gets really interesting. That is where the boutique providers and the independent data centers live. Companies like Hetzner in Germany, or OVH Cloud in France, or Akamai, which bought Linode a few years back to build out their distributed cloud, Vision. These companies actually own their own metal. They have their own racks, their own cooling systems, and their own network peering agreements.
And what is the draw for someone to go with a boutique provider like Hetzner instead of just sticking with the big guys? I assume it comes down to cost and control?
Cost is a massive factor, corn. A staggering factor, really. If you compare the price of a dedicated server at Hetzner to the equivalent compute power on Amazon Web Services, the difference is not just a few percentage points. We are talking about a fraction of the cost, sometimes 80 or 90% cheaper for raw compute and storage. The reason is that the big hyperscalers charge a massive premium for their managed services, their global reach, and their 11 nines of reliability. But if you are a company that knows how to manage its own servers, you can save millions by going closer to the metal with a boutique provider.
But that is the catch, right? You have to know how to manage it. If I go to Amazon, I can click a button and have a managed database that backs itself up and scales automatically. If I go to a smaller provider and rent a bare metal server, I am the one who has to install the operating system, configure the firewall, and set up the backup scripts. If the hard drive fails at 3 in the morning, it is my problem.
Exactly. It is the classic build versus buy or rent versus own dilemma. The work required to set up your own infrastructure is non-trivial. You are talking about hiring site reliability engineers, dealing with hardware failures, and managing your own networking. For a lot of startups, that is a distraction from their core business. They would rather pay the cloud tax to Amazon just so they do not have to think about it. But once a company reaches a certain scale, the economics flip. We saw this movement start a few years ago with David Heinemeier Hansson and the company's base camp in Hay. They famously moved off the cloud and back to their own hardware. They estimated they would save $7 million over 5 years by owning their own servers. And now, in 2026, we are seeing more mid-sized enterprises following that cloud exit path, as they realize their cloud bills have become their second largest expense after payroll.
$7 million is a lot of money, even for a successful company. But they are also experts. They have been doing this for 20 years. For a new company, trying to build that from day one seems like a recipe for disaster. You would spend all your time fixing servers and zero time building your product.
It usually is a disaster for beginners. Most people start at the top of the hierarchy with the most abstracted services like Vercel or Heroku, and then move down the stack as they grow and their needs become more specific, or their bills become too large. But let us talk about that distribution chain Daniel mentioned. There is a whole world of resellers that most people never see. These are not just companies like Vercel. There are thousands of regional managed service providers, or MSPs, who act as the bridge between the big cloud and small to medium businesses.
Right, like a local IT firm that handles the cloud migration for a law firm or a hospital. They are essentially reselling Azure or Amazon Web Services, but they are adding a layer of consulting and hands-on support. How does that actually work on a mechanical level? Do they just create an account and put it on their credit card?
No, it is much more formal than that. All the big providers have these massive partner networks. Amazon has the Amazon Web Services Partner Network, or APN. Google has the Google Cloud Partner Advantage program. To become an official reseller, you have to go through a pretty rigorous vetting process. It is not just a sign-up form. You need to have a certain number of certified engineers on staff people who have passed those grueling professional architect or security exams. You have to prove that you have successfully completed a number of customer deployments, and you often have to commit to a certain level of annual revenue.
So it is a legitimate business partnership. What is the incentive for the reseller? Do they get a discount on the compute, or is it all about the service fees?
It is both. The big providers give resellers a margin, a percentage off the list price. This is often called a tier-based discount. The more business you bring to Amazon or Google, the bigger your discount. The reseller can then use that margin to fund their operations or pass a small portion on to the customer to stay competitive. But the real money for the reseller is in the wraparound services. They charge for the initial migration, the security auditing, the ongoing 24/7 management, and the cost optimization. It is a symbiotic relationship. Amazon wants the resellers to do the heavy lifting of talking to thousands of small customers that Amazon does not want to deal with directly. The reseller gets to build a business on top of the world's most robust infrastructure without having to build their own data centers.
It reminds me of how the car industry works. Ford or Toyota does not want to sell you a car directly in most cases. They want to sell it to a dealership, and the dealership handles the customer relationship, the service, and the local marketing.
It is almost exactly like that. And just like car dealerships, these cloud resellers often specialize. You have some that only work with government agencies, which requires a whole different set of vetting protocols like FedRAMP compliance in the US. Others might specialize in healthcare and HIPAA compliance. They are taking this raw generic compute power and turning it into a specialized compliant product for a specific niche. They are the ones who handle the vetting protocols Daniel asked about. They ensure that the way the cloud is used meets the legal and security requirements of that specific industry.
So if we look at the whole ecosystem, we have the hyperscalers at the bottom providing the raw resources. Then we have the platform providers like Vercel adding developer tools. Then we have the managed service providers adding human support and consulting. And finally, you have the boutique providers off to the side, offering a cheaper, more manual alternative for the power users. It is a lot more crowded than I thought.
It is incredibly crowded. And what is interesting is how much of the internet's traffic actually flows through these middle layers. When you go to a website today, you might be interacting with a front end hosted on Vercel, which is pulling data from an API hosted on Heroku, which is storing images in an Amazon S3 bucket while using an authentication service from AuthOD. It is a chain of dependencies. If any one of those layers has an issue, even if Amazon itself is fine, the whole thing can come tumbling down. This is what we call cascading failure. And as the hierarchy gets deeper, the risk of these failures increases.
Which brings up the risk of consolidation. If 67% of the world's compute is owned by 3 companies, that is a huge amount of centralized power. We have talked about the benefits of scale, but what about the dangers? If one of these big providers decided to cut off a certain reseller or a certain type of business, they could essentially erase them from the internet. We have seen glimpses of this in the past with deplatforming controversies.
That is the dark side of the cloud. It is why we are seeing a lot of interest in multi-cloud strategies, where companies try to spread their infrastructure across multiple providers so they are not beholden to just one. But that is incredibly difficult to do in practice, because each provider has their own proprietary tools and ways of doing things. It is very easy to get locked in. If you use a specific Amazon database like DynamoDB, moving that to Google is not just a matter of copy-pasting code. It requires a massive re-engineering effort.
I imagine that is where the boutique providers find their niche. They often use more standardized, open-source technologies because they do not have the resources to build their own proprietary ecosystems. If you use a standard Linux server on a boutique provider like Hetzner, it is much easier to move that to another boutique provider than it is to move a complex serverless application off of Amazon Web Services.
Exactly. There is a certain freedom and simplicity. But the work required to maintain that simplicity is what keeps most people in the arms of the big monoliths. Think about the physical reality of what it takes to run a data center. You need redundant power feeds from the grid. You need massive diesel generators for when the grid fails, and those generators need to be tested weekly and have thousands of gallons of fuel on site. You need cooling systems that can move incredible amounts of heat. You need physical security with armed guards, biometric scanners, and man-traps, where only one person can pass through a door at a time. And then you need the network. You need multiple fiber connections from different internet service providers so that if a backhoe cuts one cable, your data center does not go dark.
When you list it out like that, it makes sense why people are willing to pay the premium. Most companies are not in the business of managing diesel generators and fiber optic peering. They are in the business of selling shoes or streaming movies or managing medical records. They want the infrastructure to be like the electricity in their office. You flip a switch and it works.
Right. But for the boutique providers, that is their core competency, and they have gotten very good at it. A company like Hetzner has built its own custom server chassis to fit more compute into a smaller space. They have optimized their cooling to be incredibly efficient, often using ambient air cooling in colder climates to save on electricity. They are competing on operational excellence. It is a different kind of scale than Amazon, but it is still impressive. They are the farmers of the digital world, while Amazon and Google are the industrial conglomerates.
So, how large is this hidden ecosystem, the one that builds under the big names?
It is massive. There are estimates that the secondary market for cloud services, meaning everything other than the raw infrastructure itself, is actually larger than the infrastructure market. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in software, services, and specialized platforms that all sit on top of the big monoliths. It is an entire economy built on top of another economy. In fact, if you look at the SaaS or software as a service market, almost all of it is essentially a reseller of cloud compute. When you pay for a subscription to a project management tool, a huge chunk of your monthly fee is just going toward the cloud hosting costs that the tool's developer is paying to AWS.
It reminds me of how the city of Jerusalem, where we live, is structured. You have these ancient foundations, and then layer after layer of history and new construction built on top of them. You might be standing in a modern shop, but 10 feet below you is a Crusader wall, and 20 feet below that is something from the Roman era. The cloud is the same way. The modern app you use is just the top layer of a very deep and complex history of infrastructure.
That is a beautiful way to put it, Korn. And just like in Jerusalem, the deeper you go, the more specialized and foundational it becomes. If you want to build a house here, you have to deal with the archaeology. If you want to build a massive digital platform, you have to deal with the archaeology of the cloud. You have to understand the layers beneath you, or you risk the whole thing sinking.
So, let us talk about the vetting protocols Daniel asked about. If I am a small company in Jerusalem, and I want to start a web hosting business, and I decide I want to build it on Google Cloud, what does that actually look like? You mentioned the partner programs, but what are the mechanics? How do I prove I am worthy to be a reseller?
Well, you would start by joining the Google Cloud Partner Advantage program. There are different tiers. Usually, it starts with a member tier where you get access to training and marketing materials. Then you move up to the partner tier, which requires you to have a certain number of professional certifications. These are not easy exams, Korn. They cover everything from cloud architecture to security to data engineering. You have to prove you understand identity and access management, virtual private clouds, and load balancing. Once you have the certifications, you have to show that you have customers. Google wants to see that you are actually bringing them business and that you know how to manage those customers effectively.
And what about the technical side? Does Google audit your setup? Do they come and look at your code?
For the higher tiers, absolutely. If you want to become a premier partner, or if you want to get a specialization in something like machine learning or cloud migrations, Google will actually perform a third-party audit of your processes and your technical deployments. They want to make sure that if you are representing their brand, you are doing it according to their well-architected framework. They check for things like, are you using multi-factor authentication? Are your databases encrypted at rest? Do you have a disaster recovery plan? It is a way of maintaining quality control across a global network of thousands of partners.
That makes sense. It protects the reputation of the platform. If a reseller does a bad job and a law firm's data gets leaked, the headline often says, Google Cloud data leak, even if it was actually the reseller's fault for misconfiguring a bucket. But it also creates a barrier to entry. It means that the middle layer of the cloud is not just a free-for-all. It is a regulated, professionalized ecosystem.
Exactly. And that is why these resellers can charge a premium. They are providing a level of assurance that the customer cannot get on their own. They are saying, we have been vetted by Google, we have the certifications, and we know how to make this work for your specific business. For a small business owner, that peace of mind is worth the extra 20% on their monthly bill.
It is interesting to think about the economics of the boutique providers in this context. They do not have these massive partner networks. They do not have thousands of certified engineers around the world. They rely on a more direct relationship with their customers. It is a much leaner business model.
It is, and that is why they can be so much cheaper. They are not spending billions on marketing and partner programs. They are spending their money on hardware and electricity. It is a very different philosophy. One is about building a global ecosystem, and the other is about providing a high-quality commodity at the lowest possible price. It is the difference between a high-end consultant and a bulk hardware supplier.
So, for our listeners who might be thinking about where to host their next project, what is the takeaway? When does it make sense to go with a monolith versus a boutique provider versus a managed platform like Vercel?
I think it comes down to where you want to spend your time and money. If you are a solo developer or a small team and you want to move fast, a platform like Vercel or Netlify is almost always the right choice. The premium you pay is worth the hundreds of hours of configuration you save. If you are a growing company with complex needs and you need the absolute highest level of reliability and global reach, say, you need to serve users in both Tokyo and New York with low latency, then going direct with one of the monoliths like Amazon Web Services or Azure makes sense. You get access to an incredible array of tools and the peace of mind that comes with their scale.
And the boutique providers? Who are they for in 2026?
They are for the people who have specific high-performance needs or who are at a scale where the cloud tax becomes unbearable. If you need a lot of raw compute or storage, maybe you are training a custom AI model or running a massive data processing job, and you have the expertise to manage it yourself, a company like Hetzner or OVH Cloud can save you a fortune. It is also a good choice for people who are concerned about privacy or who want to avoid vendor lock-in, but you have to be honest with yourself about your own technical capabilities. If you are not prepared to handle a hardware failure at 3 in the morning, stay away from the bare metal.
That is a very practical piece of advice. It is all about the trade-off between convenience and control. And as the cloud continues to evolve, those layers are only going to get more complex. We are already seeing the rise of edge computing, where the compute power is moved even closer to the user, in small data centers in every city or even on the cell towers themselves.
Edge computing is going to add a whole new dimension to this hierarchy. It is going to require even more specialized resellers and managed service providers who know how to handle the unique challenges of distributed infrastructure. Imagine trying to manage 10,000 tiny servers spread across 1,000 cities instead of one giant data center. The cloud is not going to get any simpler. It is just going to get more pervasive and more layered.
It is a fascinating time to be in this space. It feels like we are still in the early days of figuring out how to organize the world's computing power. We've gone from everyone having a server under their desk to everyone sharing massive global monoliths. And now we are seeing the pendulum swing back a bit toward more specialized and distributed models.
Exactly. It is a constant cycle of centralization and decentralization. And right now, we are in a phase where the monoliths are incredibly powerful, but the ecosystem building on top of them is where a lot of the real innovation is happening. Companies like Vercel are showing that there is still a lot of value to be added by making the cloud more accessible and more powerful for developers. They are the ones defining the developer experience of the future.
And that is the part that excites me. It is not just about the big guys getting bigger. It is about the new tools and platforms that are being built on those foundations. It is about the developers who are using those tools to build things we haven't even imagined yet. It is about the democratization of that power.
Well said, Korn. It is the classic story of technology. Each new layer of infrastructure enables a new layer of creativity and commerce. The cloud is just the latest and largest version of that story. We are building a digital civilization on top of these silicon foundations.
I think we have covered a lot of ground today. We have looked at the hyperscalers at the top, the boutique providers off to the side, the platform providers adding value, and the massive network of resellers and partners that keep the whole thing running. It is a much more complex and vibrant ecosystem than the one big computer in the sky image that most people have.
It definitely is. And I hope this gives our listeners a better sense of where their data actually lives and how it gets to them. It is a long journey from a silicon chip in a data center to the app on your phone. There are a dozen companies and 1,000 engineers in between.
Absolutely. And hey, if you have been enjoying these deep dives into the world of technology and infrastructure, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app. Whether it is Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those ratings really help new people find the show.
They really do. We love seeing the community grow and hearing your thoughts on these topics. It keeps us motivated to keep digging into these weird prompts.
You can find all of our past episodes, including our deep dives into the big cloud providers we mentioned earlier, at myweirdprompts.com. We have got an RSS feed there for subscribers and a contact form if you want to get in touch with us. You can also reach us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com.
And of course, a big thank you to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It is a topic we have touched on before, but it was great to really dig into the mechanics of the distribution and reselling networks. It is the plumbing of the 21st century.
Definitely. It is one of those things that is hidden in plain sight, but it is so fundamental to how the modern world works. Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. I am Korn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
We will see you in the next one. Goodbye.
Well, goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.